It's the Aboriginal American Blackbeard historian, and we back for another classic. I want to just salute all the people out there, the new viewers or new subscribers, new people that's sharing the tapes. I really, really appreciate it. All the people commenting and stuff, liking it, and even disliking it. I appreciate all of it. Today we're going to talk about something that has been hidden from the people, and this is one of the secrets that is kept away in the Freemasonic Lodge, and this is something that they know and study when they, become initiated into the higher orders and the higher crafts, and move on from being a neophyte into becoming the adept or the master or the magi or the hierophant or the high priest. Today we're going to talk about how the Catholic Church destroyed Jerusalem and hid this history from the people. All right, so we're going to talk about how the Catholic Church destroyed Jerusalem and hid this mystery from the people. Really, they say stuff is put in plain sight, and that's very, very true. The analogy to this story of the American Aborigines, these, humble people who were living in basically a state of plentiful. They didn't have a scarcity mentality, and they were directly in connection with basically their spiritual selves, their natural selves, and even the supernatural environment. The natural environment, these people were in line, and a lot of the stories you hear about in mythology of these, just crystal cities and things of this nature, a lot of that stuff is actually talking about America, believe it or not, the ancient America. You have to remember that these European Christian storytellers that wrote a lot of the literature that are in the school books today, these people were coming from a state of being, in hunger, in a state of wanting to have feeding frenzies. They were in a state of lack, and they didn't have much resources. So anybody, any place that they heard of that had a lot of resources was viewed as a type of heaven. And when you write stories, that could be analogous to a type of heaven you create. It's a lot of stories about the different Moorish harems or the different Islamic harems that the different Christians had. And a lot of the mythologies of just, being able to go to this place with all these beautiful women and, to be able to live like a king. Like, that was very, very mythical to a lot of those European vassal class people because they didn't have resources. So whenever they would hear about something that was a place that had a lot of resources, things were in abundance and plentiful, it wasn't really conflict going on, and you could be at a state of peace, this was viewed as a heaven. And they would show this a lot of their stories, and they showed a lot of their movies. Whatever they would make a metropolis, this is what they're talking about. And when you look into the New Testament about New Jerusalem, believe it or not, this is also synonymous with what they call the New World. So have you ever noticed that we call the Old Testament the Old Testament, and in history we call the Old World the Old World? And think about how in the Bible we call the New Testament the New Testament, and think about how we call Western history or American history the New World. So you have the Old Jerusalem and you have the New Jerusalem, okay? Now, the New Jerusalem has not been fully manifested yet. That will be manifested when the American Aborigines, who we have called in the Kabbalistic system the Hebrews, when these people wake up to their own history and realize who they are and go back in that position, that's when the New Jerusalem will be manifested on the lands of America. But until then, we're still dealing with the sufferings and dealing with the conflicts and dealing with the cataclysm, from the destruction of the Old Jerusalem. And that was brought upon by the Catholic Church. So it's not going to be put out there that the Catholic Church, destroyed the Old Jerusalem and, enslaved the Hebrews, because this would make it seem very, very, hypocritical, being that they are a Christian or Judeo-Christian or Jewish or Hebrew-based type religion. So you can't let a history come out that you basically, enslave the people that you all are Kabbalistically encoding as the Hebrews, because Hebrew basically is a language, and it is a Kabbalistic system of numerology and alphabets, So as far as the people who created that, that's the same Aboriginal people that throughout the world. All right. So when they talk about the 12 tribes of Israel being scattered throughout the world, that's just telling you about the different Aboriginal people scattered throughout the several continents. And think about how the Hebrew Phoenicians or the Phoenicians were the people responsible for the navigation, or the people responsible for, sailing the 7 seas. These were Hebrews, so when they talk about the 12 tribes scattered amongst the world, they also talk about the Hebrews who were traveling and doing trade. So right now we're going to read into the importance of the Spanish-Aztec War, the fall of Mexico, Peru, or also Jerusalem. So in history, when you're not going to see them call it Jerusalem. You're going to see them calling it Peru and Mexico. So when you see Peru and Mexico in history, when we talk about the Spanish invasion in a minute, Peru and Mexico actually is Jerusalem. Also the southern part of North America as well. So Jerusalem is basically, you can look at it as Mexico and the southern part of America, North America. All right. On into the eastern shores as well. This is why they have a Jerusalem, Georgia. All right. Think about how in a few takes back I talked about the Georgia, Carolina Aborigines. All right. And the different Yamasee Aborigines, the Creek, Choctaw, Seminole Aborigines that they found, the Floridian Aborigines. So they called Jerusalem, Georgia. They got a city in Georgia named Jerusalem. It's not by coincidence, people. So we're going to talk about 1519, which was a major European conquest by Cortez and the Spanish. And also how North America was feeding from the resources provided by the ancient empires of Central and South America. And once the Spanish invaded the Americas, this started the cataclysmic problems throughout the entire Americas. So what you got to remember is that the way our ancestors rolled, and history shows this, is that no matter where they were living, they always traveled from the south to the north, from the south to the north. Usually the more older ancient empires are in the south. And as you go north, those are the younger empires. So whether it's in ancient Egypt and Africa, the older things are in the south, and you travel north, they become younger. Same thing in America. The older things are in South America and Central America, and they become in Georgia and Florida, and they become younger as you go up into the middle central inlands of North America. All right. So this is how the history goes. So that means that in Tenochtitlan, or the last major city of the Aztecs, if this was the last, major civilization, that means that they were responsible for a lot of, resources being being dispersed throughout the entire Americas. So if their whole stronghold was put a halt and ended by the Spanish, that has a domino effect on all the other smaller civilizations around it, and all on up into us here in North America. So this is very, very important. So when you have the fall of the Aztec Empire in Tenochtitlan by the Spanish, this is the beginning of the American Revolution. Okay. Also, this is the beginning of the Catholic Church and the dismantling of Jerusalem. All right. So let's just read a little bit. I'm coming out the book, America, A Narrative History. During the 16th century, Spain created the most powerful empire in the world by conquering and colonizing the Americas. The Caribbean Sea served as the funnel through which Spain power entered the New World. After establishing colonies on Hispaniola, including Santo Domingo, which became the capital of the West Indies, the Spanish proceeded eastward to Puerto Rico in 1508 and westward to Cuba in 1511 and 1514. So now you're seeing why I'm saying the American Revolution starts in the late 1400s and in the early 1500s. The Spanish invaded Puerto Rico in 1508, invaded Cuba in 1511 and 1514. Said one soldier, "We came here to serve God and the king and also to get rich." So these people are saying they came here to steal, plunder, and get rich. No other thing. Like the French and the British after them, the Spanish who explored and conquered new worlds in the Western Hemisphere were willing to risk everything in pursuit of wealth, power, glory, or divine approval. The first adventurers were often larger than life figures, etc. The European colonialization, of the New World was difficult and deadly. Most of those in the first wave of settlement died of malnutrition or disease, but the natives suffered even more casualties. A Spaniard or Hispaniola reported in 1492. So we have an earlier date here in 1492 of the American Revolution. In 1492, that over 50,000 Aborigines had died from infectious diseases carried by the Europeans, and more were falling each day with every step like cattle in the infected herd. Even the most developed Indian societies of the 16th century were ill-equipped to resist the European cultures invading their world. This unity everywhere Civil disorder and rebellion plagued the Aztecs, Mayans, and Incas, left the Aborigine people of the New World vulnerable to division and foreign conquest. Look at this shit. The onslaught of men and microbes from Europe had complexed and overwhelmed the Aborigines. Prejudices and misunderstandings had tragic consequences. Europeans presumed that their civilization was superior to those they discovered in the New World, and such presumed superiority justified in their minds the conquest and enslavement of the Aborigines, or the Hebrews, the destruction of their way of life, and the seizure of their land and resources. So when you read about the Hebrews in the Bible, they always show you that they're the people who are living on their own land. They got their own culture, their own heritage, the way they do things. They're not really trying to mix and mingle with other people. And they just have their own spiritual system. All right, so let's just get out of the dogma right now, because the Hebrews in the Bible are an archetype for the Aboriginal people of the planet. And the more modern people that they're talking about in the New Testament are the Aboriginal people of North America, Central America, and South America. Think about it. They have the Holy Roman Empire, which is the bleached out Moorish Empire. They have the Holy Roman Empire working with some sellout Hebrews to do what? To hang and kill Yeshua. Yeshua would represent this Aboriginal people trying to live and continue their nationality. The Pharisee Sadducee class would represent those same sellout Native Americans or same sellout Aborigines who helped the invading Romans take out the original man, which was the original Hebrew Yeshua. So it's all symbolism for the same history that happened to us here in the late 1400s, early 1500s. All right. So now we're going to go into how the Catholic Church, with their 325 AD form of Christianity, and with their bleached out Caucasian Europeanized Eurozoid version of Yeshua that they call Jesus, with their mandates and their doctrines from their Jesuit orders that were given to them by the Pope, and from their allegiance to the Pope. Now the Catholic Church, with their power and investors, Isabella and Ferdinand, from the fall of the Moors, are going to continue the conquest into the Americas. And what they are not going to do is that they're going to get rid of the old Aboriginal Hebrew American way of life. If you need more information on why I'm calling the Hebrews the Aboriginal Americans, look at my old tape, Hebrew Phoenicians in America. I go through the plenty of tablets that they found throughout the entire Americas with different Paleo-Hebrew writing on it, that they are also saying was the language used by the Cherokee. So this is why I'm saying that they found Hebrew tablets in New Mexico. They found Hebrew tablets all in the Midwest. You know what I'm saying? They found them in the South. They everywhere. All right. So this is why I'm saying, like, these are the people that they talking about. The ancient Hebrews are the same Aboriginal indigenous Americans. All right. Keep that up. But now we're going to read into how the Catholic Church and how the Jesuit missionaries and mercenaries, the Christian missionaries, the Christian armies, how they came in after the fall of the Aztec Empire, and they used their bleached out doctrines to Christianize the American Aborigines. How they got us to stop using our own ancient spiritual systems, whatever they may have been, because some of us were using Arabic systems, believe it or not, Islamic. Some of us was using Hebrew systems, and you had just a multitude of other ones. So when people say, well, what was the religion of the so-called American Aborigine? There was no one religion. Everybody had just multiple forms of what they was dealing with. All right. But anyway, let's go into how the Catholic Church brought down Jerusalem. The Spaniards sought to displace the quote-unquote pagan civilizations of the Americas with their Catholic-based culture. Believing that God was on their side in this cultural exchange, the Spaniards carried with them a fervent sense of mission that bred both intolerance and zeal. The conquistadors referred or transferred to America a system known as the encomienda, whereby favored officers became privileged landowners who controlled Aboriginal villages or groups of villagers. As encomenderos, they were called upon to protect and care for the villages and support missionary priests. In turn, they could require Indians to provide them with goods and labor. Spanish America therefore developed from the start a society of extremes, wealthy conquistadors and encomenderos, at one end of the spectrum, and Aborigine people held in poverty at the other end. So here is something that the Catholic Church did through the Jesuit orders. They came in with this system, and basically what they did is started to set up shop, and whoever was going to put the more, foot on the neck of the American Aborigine or the Hebrew, whoever was going to bring more of the Christian dogma, whoever was going to get more of them to convert, to whoever killed more of them with smallpox and disease, the one that can create more rape, the one that can steal more gold, they will be held to a high esteem in the society. And it says that on the other end of the spectrum, you had the native people held in poverty. What was left of them, that is, by the mid-1500s, native or Aborigine Indians were nearly extinct in the West Indies, reduced more by European diseases than by Spanish brutality. To take their place, as early as 1503, the colonizers began to transport Africans to work as slaves, the first in the wretched traffic that eventually would carry over, quote unquote, 9 million people across the Atlantic, but we know that's not true. In all of Spain's New World Empire, by one informed estimate, the Indian population or Aborigine population dropped from about, or Hebrew population. Let me reread that so y'all can really keep this point of what I'm saying. In all of Spain's New World Empire, the Hebrew American Aborigine population dropped from about 50 million at the outset to 4 million in the 17th century, and slowly rose again to 7.5 million by the end of the 8th century. Whites, who totaled no more than 100,000 by the mid-16th century, numbered over 3 million by the end of the colonial period. The Aborigine Hebrews, however, did not always lack advocates. In many cases, Catholic missionaries offered a sharp contrast to the conquistadors. Setting an example of self-denial, they ventured into remote areas, usually without weapons or protection, to spread the gospel, and often suffered martyrdom for their efforts. So what they're saying right here is that you had a lot of these, Spanish priests that were going out into the, Aborigine Hebrew diaspora, throughout the lands of America, trying to, get people to convert, and a lot of them were killed. So, you had Aborigine Hebrews that were still fighting and, not going for that shit. Because you got to think about it. How are they going to go to this people that they didn't know anything about, these American Aborigines, right? With a whole different doctrine, with this Jesus white doctrine. And these people are not familiar with any of it. And why did they just so readily accept it? Like, what was familiar about it? There had to have been something familiar about it for them people to accept it. They weren't just going to go with a picture of some white or this Caucasian stringy haired, caveman. And then you telling me this story that sounds very, very similar to the ancient Hebrew story that they knew about. Because, like I told you all, the Lost Lunas tablet, for example, that they found in New Mexico with Paleo-Hebrew writing, ancient Hebrew writing, was found in America. All right. So that means that the American Aborigines, prior to the arrival of Europeans, already knew about the story of Moses, already knew about the Old Testament stories, already knew about the Israelite stories. They already knew about all that before the European arrived here. Let me repeat that. The American Aborigines already knew the Old Testament stories before the arrival of the Europeans. We can prove this by all the ancient tablets and stellars that they have found here in America with Paleo-Hebrew writing. So that means that the people here had to have known some of them stories. They'll also tell you that it was over 400 languages that were spoken here. So Hebrew Phoenician was definitely one of them. So that means that it was people on this land that knew those stories, because the tablets that they found were the 10 Commandments. So that means that this had to have been some form of a code that maybe some American Aborigines were using just to keep everybody in line. It could have been something as basic as that. It could have been just a code or a moral code, spiritual moral code that people just use to keep each other in line. But stick with what I'm saying. When these Spanish Europeans came here with their Catholic stories of the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus, these American Aborigines who were hearing this story already knew this story. This was not the first time they heard it. They heard it before in the Old Testament, because Yeshua is not just a New Testament figure. He's an Old Testament figure. So that's a very, very critical point that I just, pointed out. Let me see. So what I need to drop on y'all real quick, because I just told you that the Catholic Church destroyed Jerusalem. Well, I can go into that a little bit more. Okay, so let's review one more time. So the Catholic Church, through the finances and through the teaming with the Spanish Empire, the Spanish Empire made of the different bleached out families of the Holy Roman Empire, so we'll know who we're talking about. The families of Castile and Aragon being one of them. After the fall of the Moors, who were of an Islamic and Hebrew background in Europa in the late 1400s, the Catholic Church now had access to these Hebrew and Islamic Moors resources. They had access to these Islamic and Hebrew Moors maps. And they had access to these Hebrew and Islamic Moors relatives who were across the Atlantic that they were doing trade with, which is us, the Americans. When the Moors in Europa fall, the Catholic Church forces them to help them figure out the navigation, to give them boats, and to help them come over here to conquer the Americas. You had two things happen at this point. You had some Islamic and Hebrew Moors that were in Europa that said yes. And you had some Hebrew and Islamic Moors in Europa that said no. The ones that said yes, they assisted. And clearly these were the ones that showed up with any kind of European Caucasian on any boat. That clearly was somebody that said either yes or agreed in some form or fashion. The ones that said no clearly stayed in Europa and just died fighting. So when they tell you about the expulsion of the Jews, or the exodus of the Jews, or the exodus of the Hebrews of Egypt, stop putting in your mind physical Africa, East Africa, and that place of Egypt. What they really are talking about is this. The expulsion of the Hebrews is talking about two things. One part is talking about the Hebrew Moors and the Islamic Moors that were kicked out of Granada and kicked out of Southern Europe and kicked out of the entire areas of Europe. That's one part of the expulsion of the Hebrews. The other part of the expulsion of the Hebrews is what you all know of as the Trail of Tears. Let me repeat. The other story of the expulsion or the exodus of the Hebrews is what you all know of as the Trail of Tears, which was initiated by the United States government and the United States Army under Andrew Jackson and said parties involved, or, other groups involved, and them forcing the Aborigines of Florida and Georgia and the Carolinas to go westward into what we call present-day Oklahoma. And this is what they call the Trail of Tears. And the Seminole tribes of Georgia, the different various Aborigine tribes of Georgia and Alabama, they made them go west into Oklahoma. And this is what they call the Trail of Tears, or also known as the Exodus of the Hebrews. When the Spanish invaded the Aztecs and some of those people were kicked out, this is also known as the expulsion or the Exodus of the Hebrews. See, a lot of these are just cold stories. Y'all got to wait the fuck up with this shit. When they talk about these quote unquote enslaved Africans running from plantations, and they talk about Harriet Tubman and the whole Underground Railroad and her leading these slaves to freedom. Didn't they call Harriet Tubman quote unquote Black Moses? How would Harriet Tubman have known where she was going if she was a slave from Africa? How did she know to get these people from point A to point B if she wasn't familiar with the land, people? So what they call the Underground Railroad is just another code and another Masonic symbol for the expulsion or the exodus of the Hebrews. This is all code symbol for the history of one particular group of people through different points in time and through different points in history. So when you read about the hanging of Yeshua or the killing of Yeshua, that is also the same killing of Nat Turner story that they tell you all. Because Nat Turner was a Virginian American Aborigine who was doing the same thing as Denmark Vesey, as Dessalini, as Boukman, and any other American Aborigine warrior that you know was fighting against the invading European. So when they talk about any killing of the Christ story, that is what they're talking about. Because it's all the Heru mythology, people. These people are going through archetypal. This is how you all write history. This is how things work, y'all. This is how things work. Things, work in archetypal symbols. This is how stuff can be repeated throughout history through a symbol. Today, the Heru symbol is seen as the Atlanta Falcon. You know what I'm saying? The Atlanta Hawk, the Atlanta Thrasher.